Hi everyone, welcome to your next video. This one is going to be on utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is our second to last ethics topic, and this one goes side by side with Kant. So you have Kant and utilitarianism, and then they apply to the final ethics topic, which is business ethics, and that will be a final one after half term. So this one is utilitarianism with two main thinkers for this one, but quite a good one, You should enjoy it. So let's get started. All right, so Bentham is your first name, and then you have your title of utilitarianism. Please spell it right. I know there's a lot of I's and a lot of A's, so please do take your time to spell that correctly. Utilitarianism. Okay. So at the beginning we have David Hume. David Hume pops up at the start of this, but be very, very clear here, he is not a utilitarian. Utilitarianism, you have to have very certain components, and David Hume does not have these components. However, what David Hume does recognise is that ethics should be based on utility. Utility meaning usefulness. So he said that ethics should be based on what is most useful. And so then Mr. Jeremy Bentham down there came along and thought, I like that, this idea of useful. And Jeremy Bentham got started thinking, what is the most useful thing in ethics? And for him, the most useful thing was happiness. That was what was most useful. And so what Jeremy Bentham did was he said that the most useful thing was happiness. So utility as in utilitarianism, utility meaning useful. And for Jeremy Bentham, who was our first utilitarian, for him that was happiness. What Jeremy Bentham wanted to do in 1748 to 1832, he wanted to create a system of right and wrong that would benefit society. This is very, very important. It's about benefiting the majority. He believed the answer could be found in happiness, which leads people to make right ethical decisions. And he used a quote from a man named Francis Hutcheson, not Inson, Hutcheson, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I recommend you learn that quote. Again, Francis Hutcheson was not a utilitarian. Bentham took his idea of happiness and Hume's idea of utility to make utilitarianism. So I'll explain that here. So it's the combination of the two. Hence why neither David Hume nor Hutcheson are utilitarians, because Hutcheson focused on happiness, Hume focused on usefulness or utility, but it's the combination of the two. It's the adding them together by Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham created utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham is your first utilitarian. He was the one that combined Hume and Hutcheson's ideas together. And so Jeremy Bentham was the first to establish this viewpoint. He believed that the most useful thing in a moral dilemma is happiness, thus joining the views of Hume and Hutcheson to create the principle of utility. We're going to have a look at what the principle of utility is in a second. So be very, very clear that neither Hume nor Hutcheson were utilitarians. It's the joining of their ideas together. So, principle of utility. Maximise pleasure, minimise pain. And by pleasure, I mean pleasure. Bentham says that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do. Now, that's a fabulous quote, is that, but it's very, very long for you to remember for an exam. I would just remember those few words there, governance of two sovereign masters. It's clear that that is not your language. It's clear to an examiner that that is a quote from Jeremy Bentham. So the governance of two sovereign masters mean two overriding masters, two leading masters in charge of us. And the two leading things that are in charge of us is our pleasure and our pain. This theory is concerned with outcomes. So it doesn't matter how you get to that pleasure as long as the outcome is pleasure. This makes his argument teleological, ends or consequences argument. It is also hedonistic. Do you know what hedonistic means? Hedonistic means pleasure focused. This is all on pleasure. So when Jeremy Bentham uses the word happiness, he's thinking of pleasure. Utilitarianism sees moral acts as those which produce the maximum happiness and the minimum pain for the maximum number of people. So the more people that are happy, the better. So, for example, our country is a utilitarian country. That's why we have the vote system. So you go with a majority vote. Often in class I will say we'll be utilitarian and we'll vote. It's the majority that counts. There'll be a minimum number that might not like it. There'll be a minimum number in pain, so to speak, but you go with the majority. You go with the maximum number of people. So, let's say hello to Jeremy Bentham. That's actually Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was stuffed and preserved. So that is Jeremy Bentham's body. He had himself taxidermied. I don't know if that's the right word for a human being. But he had his body stuffed and preserved after he had died. Jeremy Bentham had his body preserved after death, and to this day is in the University of London. And what happens is when University of London have meetings, they roll him in his box and sit him in the meetings. Ugh. You can also go see Jeremy Bentham, so you can go visit him. Now, what reasons do you think, from what you've done so far, from what you've learned so far about Jeremy Bentham, what on earth possessed him to preserve his body? Why do you think that that would amount to happiness or pleasure? By the way, folks, that isn't his real head. His real head used to be between his feet. So if you Google the pictures, you'll see some ones with his original head. And the rumour is, this is only a rumour, the rumour is that some university students pinched and ran off with his head. And so when they finally got it back, they buried the head. And so the head is fake, but the rest of his body is his own preserved body. Why? Why do that? So, you may have said this answer. I very much doubt it though, however, as you would be the first student in 13 years of teaching this to get it right. So the reason he preserved his body, on his request, he wanted this, was because in his day, medical students performed experiments on dead bodies. Because there was good money to be made in the selling of dead bodies to science, people started to grave rob. So people used to dig up dead bodies to sell them, and then eventually murder people for their bodies to sell them. Ugh, grisly. Oh, I love horror things like this. So in his mind, he thought, what I will do then is I'll have my body stuffed and preserved to remind people not to do this. Because that's the first thing you think about when you see a dead preserved body is, I must not kill people to make money. I must not dig up dead bodies to make money. Because yes, that is the first thing that you all think of. So Bentham had his body preserved to remind people that this is not ethically the right thing to do in order to preserve happiness in society. Now, you don't need to write about that in the exam. It's just a little bit of side knowledge, bit of fun. So you don't actually talk about Jeremy Bentham preserving his body, nor digging up dead bodies, or doing it to help society. So you don't have to. It's just a little bit of fun as a side bit. All right, pleasure or pain, are they different? So, according to Bentham, that which is morally good is that which equals the greatest sum of pleasure and the least sum of pain. So, the act is right, more pleasure than pain or no pain. Act is wrong, more pain than pleasure or prevents pleasure. So, these now are very, very important questions. What do you think is happiness and pleasure? What causes happiness and pleasure? Are all pleasures morally good? And is all pain morally bad? Now, these are extremely important questions for your evaluation. What do you define as happiness and what do you define as pleasure? Are they the same thing? Bentham thinks they're the same thing, but are they? What causes and brings about happiness and pleasure? Is all pleasure good? Can you think of any pleasures that are bad? Can you think of any pleasure that is bad? And can you think of any pain that is not morally bad? So can you think of any things that bring about pain that isn't bad? I will create a Padlet because these are very, very important discussion questions that you do need to know and contribute to. So please do write this down in your notes as well because it is important for your evaluation. From your answers, what conclusions can be drawn regarding Bentham's argument for what makes an act right or wrong? So we'll come back to that once we've done the Padlet and you've thought about those answers. All right. The next part of Bentham's argument then is called the hedonic calculus. This is the pleasure seeker, I'm not kidding you. Bentham proposed a way to seek pleasure, which he calls his hedonic calculus or pleasure seeker, designed to satisfy the individual. Hedonic, pleasure, calculus, calculator. It is a calculator of pleasure. This is a way of calculating the benefit or harm of an act through its consequences. Don't forget, it's teleological consequentialist, so it's always looking at outcomes. There are 7 ways to maximise your happiness. Intensity. How intense is your pleasure going to be? Duration. How long will your pleasure last? Certainty of pleasure. How certain are you that whatever you're going to do is going to give you pleasure? Fecundity. Is it productive? Does it lead to multiple pleasures? Propinquity. How near is it to you? Do you have to go a long way to get it? Is it quite nearby? Purity. Is it all pleasure or is there a little bit of pain? Purer the better. And finally, extent. The more the merrier. The more people that can join in, the better. Now I know what you're all thinking, and please stop it. Do not be rude. This one's always quite enjoyable to teach in lesson, as you can imagine. But these are his 7. So on a serious note, you do not need to remember all 7 for an essay. However, I highly recommend that you learn at least 2 or 3, and then you will have to be able to apply them one day to business ethics, because obviously that's where we're going. So you can talk about the purity in regards to sweatshops, or you could look at the duration of us ruining the environment through business. So that's where we're going to go eventually. So I recommend you write them all down for now, but know that you don't have to learn them all when it comes for your essay. And again, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these? Are you starting to develop some weaknesses for this argument? Can you see problems with this argument? But also strengths, there'll be strengths to it as well. As I said, this is a very popular one. And it's the way our country's run, so there must be some benefits to it. So the strengths and weaknesses, some just to help you out here, but again, the more that you can do, the better. The hedonic calculus attempts to quantify happiness. Now that's very, very important. It looks for a quantity, quantify. It wants a quantity. How many of the 7 hedonic calculus do you meet? How much of that calculation do you meet? So that word quantify is very important there. The hedonic calculus attempts to quantify happiness. Is this actually possible though? If you have an immediate ethical dilemma or decision, such as having an abortion, should I have an abortion? Can you then work through those 7 to work out, well, what's the intensity, what's the duration, what's the extent of it, etc. Can you actually do that? Can you quantify how much pleasure or pain is going to be brought about by that situation? Bentham's utilitarian argument is teleological, so it relies on you accurately predicting the consequences of an action. Not always possible. For me, I'm one of these. Oh, I love homemade cake. Homemade cake is my heaven. Homemade chocolate cake. Heaven. I see this cake and I'm working out in my mind the amount of pleasure I will receive from eating that cake. I'm thinking kind of Matilda, kind of full-on gobbling style. And then you eat the cake and afterwards you think, actually, that wasn't as good as I was imagining. That wasn't actually as good as I was hoping for. And so with this in mind, you can never actually reliably predict whether that action is going to bring you the pleasure that you think it is. So I could have worked out in my head using the hedonic calculus that it's worth eating that piece of cake because in my mind I think the cake's going to be amazing, and then it's not. So it's very hard to predict accurately. And finally, what counts as pleasure? This is something that hopefully the Padlet will have drawn out as well. One person's pleasure is another person's pain. So what people find pleasurable, someone else might find painful, but it brings them pleasure. So pleasure and pain are very, very subjective and very subjective. We then bring in our second major name. This is John Stuart Mill. Now, J.S. Mill has popped up once or twice. I think he pops up in Problem of Evil, in Philosophy, and maybe a couple of other places. So, John Stuart Mill. Mill is home in utilitarianism. This is his home. John Stuart Mill is our... So you can just call him Mill or J.S. Mill. That is fine. What I'd like to do, please, I'd just like you in your notes to put these pleasures into 2 groups of your choice. You can put them in any groups you want to. You could, students in the past have put them based on things they like to do and don't like to do, things that are physical and not physical, things beginning with someone once put them into things beginning with S and things like that. So you can have any two groups of your choice as long as they're two and label them, please. So what are your two group titles? So sleeping, music, eating, reading, running, sex, art, and meditation. So please pop them into two groups of your choice. Okay, so John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Mill had a number of problems with Bentham's utilitarian arguments. Now, if I remember correctly, I think Mill is Bentham's nephew or something like that. They're in some way related. Don't write nephew in your notes, just have a little quick Wikipedia just to check that. But I know that they were related in some way. But Mill, even though was related to Bentham, did not agree with all of Bentham's arguments. So the main issues that he had against Bentham's argument were these three. Again, the numbers aren't important, but it's important to remember that there's three. Bentham, he said, does not distinguish between different sorts of pleasures or give them a rank order. So if you have multiple pleasures on offer, which one do you go with first? You can't have them all at the same time. So how do you rank order them? Or how do you know which pleasures to go for? He also questions what about minorities, so what about the minorities that are then left out? And also he says that pleasure Mill saw little more than animal instinct, sex, food, drink, because a lot of our pleasures are very animalistic, are very much based on things like food, sex and drink. So he says that they're just like animals. Mill is famous for coming up with these ideas of kind of like, he calls it a swine philosophy. Swine philosophy meaning pig, very, very animal instincts and animal activities is Bentham's, this focus on pleasures. So this is why he created his own utilitarian argument. So he's still a utilitarian, so he's still saying useful and happiness, so he's still saying those two things. But for Mill, he wants to create his own strand of utilitarianism away from Bentham. He then gives this quote. You have to write this quote down and you have to remember it. You don't have to remember both sections. You can remember half of it, but please make sure you get them in the right place. So, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Human being pig, Socrates fool. So you only, remembering all of it helps. Just doing half of it is fine. Either half is fine. There's not one half better than the other. But this quote is essential. This is where the idea of, as I said, the swine philosophy comes from, being pig satisfied. This is also where the idea of ignorance is bliss. When you're ignorant and blissful, you're just like a pig, an animal. So what I would like to do is a number of things with this quote. I first of all would like to put the quote into your own words. What is it saying? What does it mean? So he's obviously implying that it's better to be dissatisfied in your learning and understanding than just satisfied like a pig wallowing in its own muck. Or Socrates, remember Socrates drank hemlock. Socrates believed that he would keep going on this journey of knowledge and discovery. And so it's better to be Socrates constantly seeking new truths and ideas than just being a fool in your own ignorant bliss. So please pop this quote into your own words first and foremost. Second of all, I would like you again to explain why a pig and why Socrates. Taking this quote apart is very, very good for those high level answers. So why a pig? Why did it not say better than a dog satisfied or better than a crocodile satisfied? Why a pig? A pig is very specific. Why? So please do write it down. Obviously back in Mill's day they didn't realise that pigs were actually quite intelligent, so just let that by the by. But why do you think a pig from what Mill would have seen back in his day? And again, why Socrates? Why not somebody else? So what about Socrates links with this idea of knowledge and understanding? Alright, so Mill created higher and lower pleasures. Lower pleasures are those shared with animals, like pigs. Higher pleasures are those that stimulate the mind, only experienced by humans. So that list that you did a couple of slides ago, I asked them to put them into two columns. You might have done bodily pleasures and mind pleasures. That's Mill's criteria. That's Mill's categories that he separated them into. Mill recognised that in reality people do not always opt for the higher pleasure. We don't always go for things that stimulate our minds. Should I go to the opera? Should I have a McDonald's? Oh, tough choice, okay? So sometimes we don't always go for the higher pleasures. This is due to ignorance. You are ignorant. And so what he argues is that you need a competent judge. It's someone who has experienced both the higher and the lower pleasures. Their role is to help to define the amount of pleasure and pain that action causes since they've experienced both. So somebody that has had both pain and pleasure from higher and lower, they'll become a competent judge. They can judge competently which ones you should do and go down. And obviously Mill believes that you would get more gratification and more happiness overall from stimulating your higher pleasures. All right, altruism now is very, very important for Mill. Altruism is unselfishness. It's love for others. Altruism is very much like your agape, your situation ethics. This was very, very important to Mill. He produced his own principle of utility. So if you remember, Bentham's principle of utility was maximise pleasure, minimise pain. Mill's principle of utility is these three. Now, the order is important. It's because they come in rank order. So it is important to remember the rank order, and it's important to remember all three, especially if you're going for the higher grades, because they're fantastic comparisons between Bentham and Mill. Bentham's just focused on pleasure, Mill's focuses on happiness and happiness of others. So please do try and learn these three. So the first one is that happiness is desirable. You want happiness. We all want to be happy. We want happiness. Number two, happiness is the only thing desirable as an end in itself. It's the only thing as an outcome that is happiness. So you do things to get happy. You want money to be happy. You want a nice house to be happy. You want a family to be happy. The happiness is the end in itself. The happiness is the outcome. You do things to get that outcome. And finally, general happiness of all is desirable. The increase of happiness of others increases your own. So think about when you get so excited about giving somebody a gift or a present that you've really thought about and put a lot of effort into. That gives you so much happiness when you see how much they like it. This links very, very much to Jesus' golden rule. So if you remember Jesus' golden rule is do unto others as you have them do unto you. So that's Jesus' main golden rule, hence why it's golden, because it's the golden rule. And so Mill, taking that idea, said this quote: "To do as one would be done by and to love one's neighbour as oneself constitutes the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality." Basically loving your neighbour, being nice to your neighbour. Now the question is, why would Mill link his utilitarianism argument to Christianity? What's the point of it? So have a quick think. Why would Mill create a theory, his own theory, utilitarianism, but then link it so closely to Christianity? One of the reasons may be because of the audience at the time. So don't forget, when Mill was around, everybody would pretty much been Christian. Christianity would have been the predominant religion that everybody followed. And so by trying to get your audience to then go to another ethical framework or ethical theory, they'll be thinking, well, no, we're quite happy with Christianity, thanks very much. We're quite happy with Jesus and his Beatitudes, etc. We don't need any new ethical theory. So what Mill was doing here was he was trying to say, no, it's very, very similar. This is like what Jesus says, just a little bit extra. So it might have been a way for him to attract an audience that were already Christian by saying that they're very similar. Philosophical critics of Mill, we have W.D. Ross. He says a single factor: they don't account for complex lives and moral decisions. Families take precedence over reason. This is known often as the trolley example, or the trolley problem. That idea that you have a train on some train tracks, and the trainer has to go down one train track or the other train track. One train track kills somebody in your family, the other train track kills 15 people. Obviously, logically, the greatest happiness is to save the majority of people and kill some part of your family. But that would not create the happiness for yourself. So what he's saying is it doesn't take into account complex lives. You choose your family over majority of happiness for others, etc. Henry Sidgwick with the most impressive beard within all philosophy. How can we distinguish between higher and lower pleasures from each other? Which higher pleasures take priority in moral decisions? So again, what he's saying there is, Mill criticised Bentham for not rank ordering pleasures, but neither does Mill. Mill doesn't rank order the pleasures in the higher pleasures, for example. He doesn't rank order them. So how do you know which ones take priority? That idea there as well of how do we distinguish between higher and lower pleasures is very, very important. Why? Because what he is saying there is something like food. Food is a lower pleasure. Animals eat food, but what about reading a book about cooking? What about being a gourmet chef? What about being a Michelin star chef? You're still working with food, so is that animal, is that a lower pleasure, or is that actually a higher pleasure because you have educated yourself within the language of food? Or sex, for example. Sex is animalistic, etc., because animals in the animal kingdom have sex. But then what happens if you're reading a book about sex? Is that then reading or is that then sex? So sometimes pleasures are very, very hard to distinguish between the higher and the lower. Painting and artwork, you would see that as a higher pleasure because it stimulates the mind. Yet there's many elephants, for example, that can paint. There's many animals that can do things that humans can do. So is that a lower or a higher pleasure? So please do give an example to back that point up as well, because it's a very good point from Henry Sidgwick there. The final section then, act versus rule. This again is very, very important. You could get a whole question on this in the exam. An act utilitarian. Act is Bentham. Bentham is an act utilitarian. He looks at the consequences of every act situation. We already know that. He looks at the outcome. Every individual circumstance must be looked at differently. So every single case must be looked at. And you must apply the hedonic calculus to every individual act. And so he is a strong utilitarian because that above never ever changes. You always apply the hedonic calculus to every individual act. So you have a huge group of friends and they all come to you and one wants to talk about, I don't know, turning a life support machine off for a family member. One wants to talk about having an abortion. One wants to talk about whether they should do something to help the environment. One wants to talk about something else ethical. Should I break up with my boyfriend? Or someone else talks to you about these situations. You must look at every individual act individually and apply the hedonic calculus to every single one. That is strong because that never ever changes. Mill, on the other hand, is a rule utilitarian. General rules that can be applied universally across societies to promote happiness. We are a rule utilitarian country. We have rules that apply to everybody. Do not murder, do not steal, do not rape, whatever it might be. These are rules that applied across our society in order to promote happiness. It creates a balance of good over evil or pleasure over pain. These rules should not be broken as they are the basis of morality. However, Mill is a weak rule because even though he believed the rules are important for everybody and to maximise happiness across society, they can be broken in extreme situation. So in extreme situation they can be broken. So for example, do not murder, but what about self-defence? Do not have an abortion, but what happens if you're a rape victim? So you have rules that apply across society, but he's a weak rule because sometimes those rules need to be broken. But that word extreme there is very important. It has to be in extreme situations, not just, oh, I want to break the rule, so I am. It has to be extreme. You could again use the axe murderer example. So do you remember that one back from Kant? I think we did it in Kant. So that idea that always telling the truth is good, but sometimes that rule needs to be broken if an axe murderer is trying to kill somebody, for example. So I think we did that one at the end of Kant. Strengths and weaknesses of act and rule. Act is objectively applying the hedonic calculus to situation, so it provides clear guidelines, and it's objective because the same applies to everybody. This doesn't change over individuals, it's the same for everyone, so it makes it fair and unbiased. It's also subjective in that you are actually applying this to the individual situation and circumstance. The same applies to everyone, that's the hedonic calculus, HC hedonic calculus, so is equal, however it's impractical. Somebody comes to you asking for advice and you go, well, what's the intensity? What's the fecundity? What's the propinquity? What's the extent? They'll be like, for goodness sake, I just want an answer. So it's quite impractical. The hedonic calculus can also be misused to make bad ethical decisions. You could probably justify most things. I imagine you could make the hedonic calculus justify Hitler killing off the Jews in order to make Germany great again. So you can be very much misused. Rule utilitarianism is quite fair. The same rules apply to everybody. It's interested in maximising happiness for society. This is a very, very big, important distinction between Bentham and Mill. Bentham's happiness is pleasure. He sees it as pleasure, whereas Mill sees pleasure as happiness. So Bentham is pleasure, Mill is happiness. And again, that might make you pick which one you think has got a stronger argument, because again, pitching them against each other is very, very good for an essay. So do you think we should focus on happiness like Mill, or pleasure like Bentham in ethics? It's based on natural human morality, which is universal, wanting to help one another and being good and searching for happiness. However, how do you know if your situation is extreme enough to break the rules? We all have those friends where everything's a drama. Every situation is extreme. Do you break the rules every single time? So again, how do you work out whether a situation is extreme or not? So, final bit, get off the fence. I would like you now to argue and justify. So I'd like you to write a paragraph. So just a paragraph where you justify, do you find utilitarianism helpful or not? So is utilitarianism helpful as a way of moral decision making? Yes or no? You also consider, does the focus on measuring pleasure or happiness help to reach a moral decision? So could you use this? Would you use this? Second of all, which argument do you think is better, Kant or utilitarianism? So I'll write all this in an email for you, but first of all, I want you to say whether utilitarianism is useful or not, helpful or not. Second of all, who are you more Team Bentham or Team Mill? So which of their utilitarianisms do you think is better? And finally, which argument overall is more convincing? Are you more utilitarianism or are you more Kant? By that I mean, what are you more likely to apply in a situation? So if you had an ethical situation, say that one again. If you had an ethical situation or decision, which one would you more likely use? Utilitarianism or Kant, and why? All of that you write down is evaluation. And again, that's what we're really focusing on, practicing and developing is your evaluation, which from your last paragraphs that you sent me is getting much, much better. Your evaluation of ethics is far superior than your evaluation for philosophy. So fantastic effort there, folks. Really, really doing very, very well, getting off the fence and really thinking about that evaluation now. So don't forget your evaluation always has some sort of critical words, convincing, useful, helpful, and then obviously with your why, your because. So you need to really extend why it's helpful or not. All right, so we will get rid of that. Otherwise, folks, thank you very much. I hope you found this useful, and I'll be in touch shortly. Bye for now, guys. Bye, bye, bye.